Trillions of dollars are moving through the global economy right this second, entirely rerouting the wealth of nations. Established, century-old industries like logistics, commercial real estate, global finance, and automotive manufacturing are being systematically dismantled and reassembled overnight.
And the architects of this massive structural disruption aren't sprawling sovereign governments.
No.
They aren't massive international conglomerates either. They are incredibly small, hyper-focused teams of people operating out of nondescript offices, armed with nothing but laptops and a ruthless operational framework.
So the defining question you have to ask yourself today is this: what separates the handful of apex predator companies that absolutely conquer the world from the thousands upon thousands that burn through hundreds of millions of venture capital dollars only to disappear without a trace?
That is the structural puzzle of modern capitalism. The global markets are no longer dictated by whoever has the most physical factories or the deepest legacy supply chains. The future of global power is being written by a very specific, unforgiving type of organizational machinery, one that is designed to scale infinitely and capture monopoly control.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today we had a massive stack of sources to go through. Lectures, internal frameworks, and raw operational data from the very architects of the modern tech ecosystem.
We're analyzing the internal playbooks from Y Combinator, the foundational strategies of founders from Airbnb, Box, PayPal, and the top-tier venture capitalists who essentially engineer the financial fuel for these entities.
And to be clear, this isn't a conversation about making consumer apps. This is a rigorous look at money, asymmetrical power, and the structural forces dictating the future of the global economy.
Software is quite literally eating the world.
Exactly. And understanding this machinery is your definitive shortcut to understanding exactly where global power is shifting today and how it's being wielded. Before we jump into the mechanics, make sure to subscribe for future deep dives, because understanding these underlying frameworks is absolutely essential for anyone navigating, investing in, or really just trying to survive the modern economy.
Okay, let's unpack this. What actually is a startup? Because most people, even those operating within the business world, still think of a startup as just a younger, smaller version of a normal corporate business.
Yeah, and that is a fundamental misunderstanding. The sources from these top accelerators make a much more aggressive distinction. A startup is an organization strictly optimized for hypergrowth, period. If it's not growing exponentially, it's just a small business.
It's a binary definition.
It really is. The distinction is everything. A traditional small business, say a boutique consulting firm or a regional logistics company, it's designed to generate steady revenue, service a localized or defined market, and maybe grow by a few percentage points a year, which is perfectly fine, but it's not a startup.
Right. A startup's DNA is fundamentally alien to that. It is engineered from day one for hypergrowth, meaning it's built to scale its user base and revenue exponentially without a corresponding exponential increase in its underlying costs.
And the sources break down this brutal, unforgiving equation of success for these hypergrowth machines.
They do. It breaks down to 5 variables: idea times product times execution times team times luck.
Let's focus on that math for a second, because it operates entirely on multiplication, not addition.
Exactly. Meaning, if any one of those variables is a 0, the entire outcome is 0, regardless of how strong the other components are.
That is mathematically terrifying.
It's the mathematical cruelty of the model. You can have a brilliant idea, a flawless product, and a world-class team, but if your execution is a 0, the company is worthless.
And then there's the luck factor.
Right. In this equation, the luck variable is basically a random multiplier between 0 and 10,000. The architecture of a startup is about controlling the first 4 variables: idea, product, execution, team, and optimizing them to such an extreme degree that you simply earn the right to roll the dice on that massive luck multiplier.
You're building a machine robust enough to survive until the macroeconomic timing aligns perfectly with your offering.
Exactly.
Which brings us to a really crucial question. Why is this specific hypergrowth model dominating right now? Why is this the exact moment in economic history where a team of 3 people can suddenly topple massive incumbents that have existed for a century?
It comes down to unprecedented macroeconomic tailwinds. We're living through a unique period where the barrier to entry for global distribution has completely plummeted. It's near 0.
It wasn't always like this.
Not at all. Historically, if you wanted to build a company that reached 100 million people, the capital requirements were astronomical. You needed to build physical factories. establish global supply chains, negotiate with international shipping cartels, deploy fleets of physical trucks.
The capital moat protected the incumbents. Nobody could compete because nobody could afford the entrance fee.
Precisely. But today, the raw materials of industry have changed entirely. You need rented servers, proprietary code, and a broadband internet connection.
Which ties back to that famous venture capital maxim that software is eating the world.
And it's a literal consumption. Because the cost of cloud computing has dropped so radically, and because global smartphone penetration has effectively connected half the human race to a single digital grid, a tiny team can deploy a product to 1 billion people globally in a matter of days.
And the marginal cost of replicating that product is effectively zero.
Zero. Which completely invalidates the historical defense mechanisms of the world's largest corporations.
It completely flips the traditional script on who benefits and who loses in this economy. If you're analyzing a market today, you have to realize that the traditional markers of business strength are now vulnerabilities.
Massive headcount, huge physical footprints, decades of legacy relationships. These are actually massive liabilities now.
Let's look at the incumbents for a second, the so-called losers in this equation.
If you're an incumbent, you have legacy IT systems built in the 1990s that cannot be easily updated.
Yeah.
You have tens of thousands of middle managers who are, quite frankly, highly incentivized to resist any operational change that threatens their specific department.
Because it threatens their job security.
Exactly. And most dangerously, you have existing, highly profitable revenue streams that your board of directors is absolutely terrified of cannibalizing. You are paralyzed by your own size.
Conversely, the playing field is shockingly even for the challengers. Being young, inexperienced, resource-poor, and completely unknown is actually a massive structural asset in this specific environment.
It's an asset because you aren't tied to the status quo.
You don't have a legacy product to protect.
You have nothing to lose, which means you can attack the systemic inefficiencies of the market with pure, aggressive focus. A poor, unknown founder can look at the global banking system, realize the friction in cross-border payments is absurd, and simply build a digital bypass.
They don't have to worry about protecting an existing network of physical bank branches.
Exactly. The losers in the modern economy are the slow-moving incumbents who physically cannot adapt fast enough to the changing technological raw materials, while the winners are the hyper-focused teams leveraging zero marginal cost software to strip mine the incumbents' profit margins.
But even with that massive asymmetric advantage, the vast majority of these young, aggressive founders fail spectacularly.
They do.
Looking at the notes from the venture capital partners, there is a recurring psychological trap that destroys early-stage companies. We can call it the fundamental amateur error, or playing business.
Playing business is the most pervasive killer of early potential. You have to understand the psychology of the people who typically start these companies. They're often highly educated, driven individuals who have spent the last 20 years in an academic or corporate system learning how to optimize for external validation.
They know how to game the system.
Exactly. They know how to study just enough for the test, how to network with the right executives, how to check the specific boxes that trigger a promotion, and they bring that exact same institutional mentality to the raw, unstructured environment of a startup.
And they try to play business. They treat the startup like an elaborate resume builder or a theatrical production.
They focus on the optics of success rather than the mechanics of value creation. They waste their incredibly limited seed capital renting a fancy, exposed brick office in a trendy tech neighborhood. Why? Because that's what a real company does.
They obsess over public relations, securing speaking slots at industry conferences, designing the perfect logo.
Right, and they view the act of raising a round of venture capital as the actual measure of success, rather than viewing it for what it is, which is taking on a massive high-interest loan that drastically increases expectations.
They look for artificial growth hacks to temporarily inflate their user numbers to impress investors, completely ignoring whether those users are actually extracting any real value from the software.
But the market does not care about your resume, and it doesn't care about your office space. The market is a brutally efficient weighing machine.
Playing business is a trap, because gaming the system instantly stops working when you hit the unforgiving reality of user adoption.
You cannot trick 1 million people into using a fundamentally useless product day after day. Ideas dictate the theoretical size of the market and the overarching strategy. but they are entirely worthless without ruthless execution.
If a founding team focuses on the optics rather than agonizing over solving a tangible, painful problem for a highly specific group of people, they are mathematically doomed.
They will run out of capital while polishing their slide decks.
Which brings us to the actual product side. How do these teams actually capture the market? If you're trying to build one of these companies and you realize you cannot rely on PR, fancy offices, or superficial growth hacks, what is the actual ground-level mechanism of capturing a market?
It comes down to a structural force that the top accelerators define as the law of conservation of happiness.
I love this concept. Let's break this down.
When you launch a company on day one, you have a severely limited amount of resources: time, capital, engineering bandwidth. Therefore, there is a limited amount of total value or happiness you can inject into the world through your product.
So you face a binary choice.
Exactly. You can either spread that limited happiness very thinly across a massive number of people, resulting in a product that a large number of users simply like, or you can concentrate all of that happiness onto a very small, specific demographic, resulting in a product that a tiny number of users absolutely love.
And the psychological instinct for almost every founder is to go for the big number.
Because everyone wants to launch and immediately have 1 million users. It validates their ego and looks great on a tech blog.
Which is precisely why most fail.
It is infinitely better and structurally necessary to build a product that a small number of users love, because if you build something that people merely like, you have no defensive moat. The second, a slightly better, slightly cheaper, or slightly better marketed alternative appears, those users will abandon you without a second thought.
Churn will destroy your underlying unit economics.
But if you build something a core group of people absolutely love, those users become your foundational infrastructure. They become your unpaid marketing department.
They'll forgive your early software bugs. They'll aggressively evangelize your product to their peers.
And they will force organic, exponential growth that no amount of paid advertising could ever replicate. It is vastly easier to expand from something a few people love to something a lot of people love than it is to take a product people merely like and try to artificially convince them to love it.
The sources constantly point to the early days of Facebook and Google as the ultimate historical proof of this concept. When you strip away their current trillion-dollar valuations, their genesis moments perfectly illustrate this focused intensity.
Look at the very first iteration of Facebook. It was almost comically simple. It wasn't trying to connect the global population. It was exclusively a directory for Harvard college students, solving a highly specific, intense social need for a few thousand 19-year-olds.
So those students didn't just like it. They were obsessively addicted to it.
Exactly. And look at Google in the late 1990s. The incumbent search engines like Yahoo and Excite were massive, cluttered web portals. They were filled with weather, news, stock tickers, flashing advertisement. They were trying to be everything to everyone.
And Google launched as a notoriously ugly, stripped-down white web page with a single text box and 2 buttons.
But it executed its core function, which was returning highly relevant search results, an order of magnitude better than anyone else. The early users loved it, and that absolute loyalty provided the foundation for global dominance.
Because they secured that intense love from a small group, the founders were able to engage in a counterintuitive practice that the sources emphasize repeatedly: doing things that don't scale.
That is the crucial operational secret of the early stage. Doing things that don't scale means manually compensating for the limitations of your early software through sheer human effort.
It means the CEO acting as their own frontline customer support.
Literally sitting next to early users in coffee shops to watch them navigate the interface. Or manually onboarding clients one by one. If you put layers of account managers or automated ticketing systems between you and your early users, you completely sever the raw, unfiltered feedback loop necessary to iterate the product.
You lose the signal and the noise.
You blind yourself. Most startups do not die because they are crushed by a massive evil competitor. That is a myth founders tell themselves to feel better about failure.
They die simply because they fail to make something users genuinely love.
They build something mediocre, the market responds with complete apathy, and they quietly run out of venture capital.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's push this conversation into much sharper territory. We've established the raw mechanics of getting off the ground. Focusing on a small niche, executing violently, generating intense user love. But if the entire goal is this relentless hyper-growth trajectory, what happens when these companies collide with the real world of global competition? What is the actual end game here?
What's fascinating here is that the endgame completely subverts and destroys how we are traditionally taught to think about capitalism in university economics courses. The definitive, ruthless power dynamic of the modern economy, as articulated by thinkers like Peter Thiel, is this: competition is for losers.
That is a highly aggressive, deeply controversial statement. I mean, we are taught that competition is the absolute lifeblood of the free market. It drives innovation, lowers prices, benefits society.
It is the lifeblood for the consumer,
Oh,
absolutely,
yeah.
but it's an absolute nightmare for the business entity itself.
Let's break down the deep economic implications of power structures and value.
To build a highly valuable generational company, you have to satisfy two completely independent mathematical variables. First, you must create X dollars of value for the world. Second, you must capture Y percentage of that X for your own balance sheet.
X and Y.
The crucial, often misunderstood reality that destroys most businesses is that X and Y are completely independent of each other.
Meaning you can create massive, world-altering value for humanity, but capture absolutely zero of it for yourself, rendering your company financially worthless.
Let's look at a profound cross-industry comparison that illustrates this perfectly. Take the United States airline industry. Airlines create staggering, almost unfathomable amounts of value for the global economy.
They allow international commerce to function smoothly. They move millions of people across oceans in a matter of hours.
So the X, the total value created for society, is easily in the trillions of dollars. But what is Y? What is their capture rate? Because the airline industry is in a state of near-perfect competition, airlines offer a largely commoditized service. To win passengers, they are forced to constantly undercut each other on ticket prices.
It's a race to the bottom.
It is a permanent war of attrition. Their profit margins are microscopic, often hovering around 1 or 2% in a good year, and deeply negative during minor economic downturns. They capture almost 0% of the massive value they create.
Historically, almost every major U.S. airline has gone bankrupt at least once.
They are massive engines of value creation, but terrible businesses.
And then you contrast that brutal reality with the architecture of a tech monopoly.
Contrast the airlines with a digital monopoly like Google's search business. Organizing the world's information is incredibly valuable, undoubtedly. But because Google operates as a functional monopoly in the search space, controlling over 90% of the global market, it does not have to engage in a race to the bottom.
It doesn't have to constantly slash the price of its advertising inventory to fend off a dozen equally matched competitors.
It dictates the terms of the market. Therefore, it captures a massive percentage of the value it creates, generating tens of billions of dollars in pure, unadulterated cash profit every single quarter.
Perfect competition means all excess profits are competed away by rivals.
Monopoly means you own the ecosystem and extract the rent. Therefore, the unstated goal of every serious, venture-backed startup is not to build a competitive business. It is to build a monopoly.
But no corporate CEO ever stands in front of a microphone and admits they are running a monopoly.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the deep political and societal dimensions, the elaborate lies companies tell to protect their power.
Hidden incentives drive profound market distortions, especially in how companies communicate their position to the public and to regulators. Monopolies are terrified of one thing above all else: government intervention and antitrust regulation.
Because if the government realizes you are a monopoly, they will break you up or regulate your profit margins into oblivion.
So, monopolies systematically lie about their market dominance. They go to extreme lengths to pretend they are in massive, highly competitive markets facing existential threats from all sides.
You see this in every congressional hearing. The CEO of a tech giant will sit before lawmakers and claim they are just a tiny fish in a massive ocean.
Look at how Google defines itself defensively. They will never say, "We have a 90% monopoly on global search and generate most of our revenue from search ads." Instead, they will define themselves broadly as a technology company. They will claim they are locked in a brutal, multi-trillion-dollar fight for survival.
They'll point out they are competing against Apple in mobile operating systems, against Amazon in cloud infrastructure, against Microsoft in enterprise software, even against traditional auto manufacturers in autonomous driving.
By inflating the denominator, defining their market as all of global technology, they make their specific market share look incredibly small and heavily contested. It is a deliberate narrative distortion to avoid antitrust scrutiny.
And on the flip side of that distortion, the non-monopolies, the desperate startups trying to look powerful, they lie in the exact opposite direction.
The symmetry is fascinating. A company operating in a fiercely competitive, low-margin space is desperate to attract venture capital and media attention. Let's use the example of a new restaurant opening in a notoriously crowded, competitive market, like New York City.
Okay.
If they admit they are just another restaurant fighting for thin margins against 10,000 others, no one will invest. So they lie by intersection. They claim they are not a restaurant. They claim they are the only provider serving a highly specific proprietary fusion of British and Nepalese cuisine within a 3-block radius of a major tech campus.
They invent a hyper-niche market where they're the only player, pretending they dominate a space that doesn't actually exist.
Monopolies desperately pretend to be small and threatened. Non-monopolies desperately pretend to be huge and dominant.
So practically speaking, moving past the narrative games, what are the actual technological dimensions required to build a monopoly? Because you can't just declare yourself a monopoly. You have to construct an impenetrable moat.
You must possess proprietary technology that is an order of magnitude, meaning at least 10 times better than the next best alternative. This is a critical threshold.
It can't just be a little bit better.
If your software is only 20% better than the legacy system, the switching costs for the consumer or the enterprise are simply too high. The friction of retraining staff, migrating data, changing habits, it will outweigh a 20% improvement. They won't bother.
But a 10x improvement forces adoption.
In its early days, Amazon didn't just have a slightly better layout than a physical bookstore. Because they didn't require physical retail shelf space, they could offer 10 times more book titles than the absolute largest physical bookstore on Earth. The difference in inventory was exponential, not incremental.
Beyond the 10x product, you also need to engineer network effects and leverage extreme economies of scale.
Network effects are the ultimate defensive moat. It means the core product becomes fundamentally more valuable to every existing user with each new user that joins. Think of a social network, a peer-to-peer payment platform, or a two-sided marketplace like Airbnb.
A telephone network is useless if you are the only one with a phone. It becomes indispensable when everyone has one.
And economies of scale are uniquely weaponized in software because, as we discussed earlier, the marginal cost of producing an additional copy of a digital product is zero. Once a software company covers its fixed engineering costs, the revenue from user number 10,000 and user number 10 million is almost pure profit.
This dynamic allows software monopolies to generate cash flow at a speed and scale that physical industrial businesses simply cannot comprehend. If building a monopoly requires that level of ruthless efficiency, audacious scale, and 10x better technology, it begs the question of how you convince investors to fund something so incredibly risky on day one. Let's shift gears and look at the financial fuel driving this entire ecosystem. Venture capital. Trillions of dollars of risk capital floating around the global markets. How does this specialized class of investors actually view the risk of building a monopoly from scratch?
The venture capital mindset is deeply counterintuitive to traditional finance. It operates on a framework we can call the onion theory of risk.
Okay, let's unpack this. The onion theory. How does a VC price the terrifying risk of a company that has no revenue and no product?
Think of a startup on day one not as a business, but as nothing more than a giant, glowing, highly unstable ball of concentrated risk. When a VC looks at a seed stage team, they see multiple intersecting layers of fatal risks.
Layer upon layer.
You have foundational team risk. Will these co-founders crack under pressure and sue each other? You have profound product risk. Does the engineering team actually have the technical capability to build this 10x technology?
You face massive market risk. Even if they build it, will anyone actually pay money for it?
And beyond that, you have distribution risk, regulatory risk, macroeconomic risk.
It's a miracle anyone writes a check at all.
The mechanism of venture capital is not about funding a finished product. Raising capital is not a measure of success. It is a mechanism to purchase time. You are selling equity to buy the time necessary to systematically eliminate risk.
You use the initial seed capital to peel away the very first layer of the onion.
For example, you use the seed money to hire 3 brilliant engineers and build a working prototype, thereby eliminating the core product risk.
And once that specific layer of risk is peeled away, the fundamental nature of the company changes. It is mathematically less risky than it was 6 months ago, which justifies going back to the markets to raise the next round of funding at a significantly higher valuation.
Precisely the mechanic. You raise the Series A round at a higher valuation, taking less dilution, specifically to purchase the time to peel away the market risk, proving that users will actually pay for the prototype.
Once you prove unit economics, you raise a massive Series B round to peel away the scaling and distribution risk.
The entire life cycle is a sequential unwinding of risk, funded by increasingly larger pools of capital. But the hidden incentive here, the reality that shocks most outsiders, is that top-tier VCs are absolutely not looking for safe bets.
That sounds backward.
The company that presents itself with no obvious flaws. They have a decent team, a decent idea, checking all the standard corporate boxes, operating in a known market. That is actually viewed as mediocre. It will never achieve the escape velocity required to build a multi-billion-dollar monopoly.
So what are the elite investors actually hunting for? If they don't want a perfectly balanced, safe company, what is the profile of a massive winner?
Elite venture capitalists invest almost exclusively in the presence of extreme, terrifying strength, not the absence of weakness. When you look at the historical data of massive winners, the early days of companies that go on to redefine industries, they usually possess a singular, overwhelming strength that is paired alongside serious, almost fatal flaws.
So if a founder is a visionary, borderline obsessive genius who has built a product that early users are literally addicted to,
The VC will eagerly overlook the fact that the founder is abrasive, has no formal business training, and has absolutely no idea how to manage a corporate balance sheet.
the VC's logic is simple. Extreme strength is unteachable and unbuyable.
Fatal flaws in management or finance can be patched. They will fund the extreme strengths with a massive check, and then use their network and capital to artificially graft a veteran chief financial officer or chief operating officer onto the company to babysit the fatal flaw.
That is fascinating. Before we move on, if you're analyzing these markets, or if you're simply valuing this long-form, intense breakdown of global business mechanics, please take a second to like this deep dive. It actively helps us continue to decode these frameworks for you. Let's push this analysis beyond the surface level of product mechanics and venture capital strategy. I want to frame this next phase around the internal engine of these organizations, the humans.
A culture.
Exactly. We're talking about scaling an organization from 3 founders in a garage to 10,000 employees operating globally in a matter of a few years. How do these hyper-growth machines not just physically shake apart at the seams from the organizational friction?
That transition. Moving from a small team that has found product market fit to actually scaling a massive global enterprise, that is where the vast majority of promising startups suffer catastrophic failure. And survival in this phase hinges entirely on the second and third order effects of company culture and ruthless management psychology.
Culture is such a corrupted buzzword today. In the mainstream corporate world, everyone claims they have a great culture because they installed a ping pong table in the break room, offer free kombucha, and let people work from home on Fridays.
But the sources from the top accelerators define culture much more rigidly, almost as a weapon. Culture has absolutely nothing to do with office perks or superficial employee benefits. Culture is a strict operating system.
An operating system.
It is the underlying invisible framework for how a collective group of thousands of people makes decisions when the founder is nowhere near the room. Let's look at Airbnb's foundational approach to this, which was heavily influenced by their time at Y Combinator. They utilize a very precise, almost psychological metaphor. Founders are the parents, and the company is the child.
And a child will eventually, inevitably, manifest the behaviors, neuroses, and dysfunctions of the parent's underlying relationship.
If the founding team is deeply dysfunctional, highly secretive, prone to backstabbing, or misaligned on core values, the organization they build will inevitably scale into a toxic, bureaucratic nightmare.
Which explains why Airbnb utilized that incredibly intense, almost unbelievable filter in their early hiring process. The sources detail how they literally asked early executive candidates, "Would you take this job if you had 1 year left to live?"
It sounds extreme, and quite frankly, it would likely be considered legally or HR questionable in a legacy corporate context. But the philosophical logic behind it is vital for hypergrowth. They were attempting to filter out mercenaries.
They weren't looking for employees who just wanted a salary and a resume boost.
They were looking for missionaries who fundamentally believed in the vision of a restructured global hospitality market. They understood a critical truth. Culture must be deliberately, obsessively designed. If you do not proactively design your culture, it will automatically default to a random amalgamation of the personalities of whoever you happen to hire.
And that accidental default culture invariably becomes a massive liability that breeds internal politics and slows the company to a halt just when it needs to move the fastest.
Yes.
Let's explore the hard truths of management here. Because being a visionary founder who can code a brilliant product is a completely different psychological profile than being a competent CEO who can manage the egos and operations of a 1,000-person company.
It requires a total psychological rewiring. The single most critical management concept, and the one that brilliant, empathetic founders struggle with the absolute most, is learning to see every single managerial decision through the eyes of the entire company, not just through the eyes of the individual employee sitting across the desk from them.
Let's make this concrete. Let's use a specific, real-world scenario drawn from the internal management frameworks of top venture firms. Let's analyze the demotion.
This is a classic trap.
You have a hard-working, highly dedicated executive. They were there from day one. They slept under their desk to launch the prototype. Because they were so early, they own 1.5% of the company, which in a hyper-growth startup is a massive, life-changing amount of equity.
Perfect.
But as the company scales from 50 to 500 people, the complexity of the operation outgrows them. They are in way over their head.
They're failing.
Right. The founder, who is close friends with this person, wants to be compassionate. So instead of firing them, the founder decides to quietly demote them, let them keep their equity, and hire a seasoned veteran from outside to be their new boss. On the surface, to a normal person, it seems incredibly compassionate and fair.
But the second and third order structural effects of that decision are absolutely disastrous. If a CEO views that decision only through the eyes of that specific executive, it seems like a win-win. The executive avoids the humiliation of being fired, they keep their massive equity stake, and they get to stay with their friends.
But a CEO must view that exact same decision through the eyes of the incredibly talented engineers who were hired 2 years later.
Those engineers are grinding 80 hours a week, driving the current growth of the company, but because they joined later, they are only earning 0.1% equity. They look at this demoted executive who actively failed at their job and is now contributing less value, but who still holds a massive 1.5% of the company.
It instantly destroys the illusion of meritocracy.
It shatters it completely. The unstated, invisible cultural rule that permeates the engineering floor instantly becomes: effort and current results do not matter. Early employees are an untouchable aristocracy who are rewarded simply for being here first. Deep resentment breeds.
Your absolute best, most ambitious engineers, the people you desperately need to retain, will realize the game is rigged, and they will leave for a competitor where actual performance is rewarded.
A compassionate decision for one individual creates a toxic environment for 1,000 others.
Another brilliant, highly destructive scenario highlighted in the management frameworks is what we can call the leverage scenario, specifically regarding an extortionary raise request.
This happens all the time.
You have an excellent, crucial employee who comes into the CEO's office. They know they are critical to an upcoming product launch. They use that leverage to explicitly demand an off-cycle massive salary increase. They deserve the money based on output. The founder's immediate instinct is to just say yes, keep the peace, secure the product launch, and give them the money.
Again, this is a catastrophic failure of second-order thinking. If a CEO capitulates and gives a massive raise simply because an aggressive employee leverages their position to ask for it, word will inevitably get out. In an organization of any size, it is mathematically impossible to keep compensation secrets forever.
Someone will talk.
Always. When the rest of the company finds out, what is the logical cultural conclusion they draw about how compensation is determined?
The conclusion is that hard work doesn't equal a raise. You have to actively threaten the company and constantly demand raises to get paid your market value.
Exactly the dynamic. The unstated cultural rule becomes that the company leadership does not proactively evaluate performance. They only respond to aggression and extortion. So look at the consequences for your best, most introverted, highly focused engineers. The ones quietly putting on their headphones and building the core technology that sustains the company.
They will feel profoundly cheated.
They will either be forced to act against their nature and become aggressive, political negotiators, which ruins their morale and distracts them from their work, or, much more likely, they will simply quit and go to a mature tech company that has a structured, proactive system for rewarding top performers.
Which is exactly why the sources emphasize that strict, formal, almost bureaucratic processes actually protect the core culture as you scale. You need a rigid, formal performance review process so everyone, from the newest hire to the earliest executive, knows that the rules of the game are objective and fair.
Formal process, implemented correctly, protects the culture from the founder's own biases and inherent desire to avoid conflict. And within that rigid operational structure, the CEO must evolve into a maniacal execution machine.
The famous Silicon Valley cultural mandate to move fast and break things.
But that only functions if it is counterbalanced with an absolute, uncompromising obsession with quality control. Indecisiveness is the ultimate startup killer. A CEO must understand that a mediocre operational decision executed violently and decisively today is vastly superior to a theoretically perfect decision that takes a month of committee meetings to execute.
The CEO's primary job is to set a relentless, punishing operating rhythm that forces the entire organization to ship product and react to the market faster than the incumbents can process the service.
Precisely.
So what does this all mean? Let's challenge the underlying assumptions here. We've talked extensively about the raw mechanics of hypergrowth, the brutal realities of monopoly economics, how venture capitalists price existential risk, and the severe psychological frameworks required to manage a rapidly scaling culture. But if these startups actually succeed in navigating this incredible minefield, what happens next? What is the long-term trajectory for these apex predator companies, and more importantly, for the global markets they disrupt?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the hardest structural shift for a founder is the transition from building a great individual product to building a great company that can reliably and repeatedly produce great products over a time frame of decades.
Let's map out the divergent scenarios based on the data. What is the absolute best-case trajectory for a hyper-growth company that escapes the startup phase?
The best case scenario is that the organization transcends its original product and creates an internal culture of repeatable systemic innovation. The historical benchmark here is Apple. They didn't just build the Mac and stop. They built an organizational machine, a supply chain mastery, and a design philosophy that could eventually produce the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad, and the wearables division.
They transition seamlessly from using an initial wedge product to gain a foothold into exerting total global platform dominance.
Today, the most lucrative, high-stakes battleground for this exact type of expansion is the enterprise IT market, which represents roughly $3.7 trillion of global spending.
But historically, enterprise IT used to be notoriously unsexy. It was completely locked down by legacy incumbents like IBM and Oracle. It wasn't a space where a fast-moving startup could easily gain a foothold because the sales cycle was entirely top-down.
It was incredibly gated. In the past, if a startup wanted to sell software to a Fortune 500 company, they had to engage in a 2-year sales cycle. They had to take the chief information officer out to play golf, endure endless security audits, and try to sell a multi-million-dollar software package from the top down.
But the best-case trajectory for modern startups uses what we call the user-led or bottom-up adoption model.
Because of the proliferation of smartphones and frictionless cloud computing, employees now simply bring their own digital tools to work. Modern startups inject high-quality consumer-grade DNA into boring enterprise software.
They make enterprise software feel like an iPhone app.
And by doing so, they bypass the traditional IT bottlenecks entirely. A single employee in the marketing department downloads a free version of a collaboration tool or a data analytics platform. They love it. They invite 3 colleagues. It spreads virally through the department, dramatically increasing their productivity.
By the time the legacy chief information officer even realizes what is happening on their network, the startup software is already deeply embedded in the company's daily infrastructure.
At that point, the startup simply approaches the CIO and says, half your company is already using our product. Here is the enterprise licensing bill. It is a devastatingly effective strategy to capture the most lucrative market on Earth.
That is the path to becoming a trillion-dollar platform. But what about the worst-case scenario? Let's look at the failure modes that take down companies that have already achieved product-market fit. We aren't just talking about running out of venture capital. What kills the successful ones?
The ultimate, often unrecorded silent killer of highly successful startups is founder burnout. The founders achieve massive scale, but they stay in early-stage hero mode for too long. They refuse to delegate authority. They try to micromanage a 1,000-person company the way they managed a 3-person team, and their psychology simply collapses under the weight of the operation.
Closely related to that is a catastrophic co-founder blowup, which venture data shows is the #1 cause of early company death.
But mathematically, the most dangerous failure mode is focusing on the optics of success: PR, conferences, inflating vanity metrics. While ignoring the underlying health of the product data, you have to look at the retention curve.
The retention curve. Let's explain Alex Schultz's concept from the growth lectures, because it is the ultimate lie detector for a business.
As growth expert Alex Schultz definitively states, you can track the percentage of users who return to your product over time. If you plot that on a graph and your retention curve slopes downward and eventually hits the x-axis, meaning that over a long enough timeline, every single user who tries your product eventually stops using it completely, you are fundamentally, structurally dead.
It absolutely does not matter how many millions of new users you are acquiring through brilliant marketing or viral growth hacks.
You are simply pouring expensive water into a bucket with a massive, irreparable hole in the bottom. You are scaling a failure.
Let's look further out. If we project these models forward, what are the 10 to 20-year macroeconomic consequences for the global economy? Where is this massive shift in technological power leading us?
The long-term trajectory points toward profound, almost 19th century levels of vertical integration. For the last 40 years, the prevailing corporate trend was outsourcing. Legacy companies were taught to focus entirely on their core competencies and outsource everything else. Manufacturing to Asia, IT to contractors, logistics to third parties.
But the future of massive, durable monopolies looks incredibly different. Look at apex companies like SpaceX or Tesla. They operate on a framework of deep vertical integration.
They don't just design the product and outsource the rest. They build the underlying software. They physically manufacture the hardware. They engineer the raw materials. They control the supply chain down to the atomic level. And they own the direct-to-consumer distribution network.
They own the entire stack, eliminating any dependency on third-party vendors who could slow them down or extract margins.
Yes, we are moving rapidly from a world of customized, fragmented software solving niche regional problems to a world of standardized, monolithic, global platforms. Every single legacy industry, from global logistics to healthcare management to commercial real estate, will be brutally forced to either adapt to these new digital infrastructures or they will simply cease to exist.
The macroeconomic ripple effects are staggering. A company like Uber didn't just affect the localized market of taxi drivers. Its structural model altered the economics of auto manufacturing, shifted public transit usage, and is actively reshaping how cities approach urban planning.
It changes everything.
So for you listening, whether you are an investor, an executive at a legacy company, or someone attempting to build a challenger, what are the specific signals to watch? How do you identify the next apex predator in the market before it becomes a monopoly?
You have to look for counterintuitive signals. Watch for companies that start intentionally small. The true apex predators rarely announce on day one that they are going to conquer a multi-trillion-dollar global market. Instead, they find a tiny, seemingly insignificant, highly specific niche.
They absolutely dominated, achieving a monopoly in that microeconomy.
And then they relentlessly expand outward in concentric circles, using the cash flow and user base from the first niche to fund the conquest of the next. Additionally, you must analyze the psychology of the founders. You are looking for an intense, almost unbalanced obsession with winning and product quality.
Founders who prioritize superficial lifestyle perks or who preach about achieving a perfectly balanced life in the early stages of company building are fundamentally not the psychological profiles that build the ruthless monopolies dictating the future of the global economy.
They just aren't.
Okay, let's synthesize the massive amount of ground we've covered today. We started with the raw, uncompromising definition of hypergrowth and the 5-part mathematical equation that governs startup survival.
We broke down Peter Thiel's ruthless economic mechanics of building a monopoly, creating value versus capturing value, and the deliberate lies companies tell to hide their power from regulators.
We unpacked the venture capital onion theory of risk, analyzing how elite investors hunt for extreme strengths rather than safe mediocrity. And we peered deep into the brutal psychology required to manage a rapidly scaling company. From the intense cultural filters of early Airbnb to the rigid frameworks a CEO must employ to survive leveraged scenarios and maintain a true meritocracy.
It is a comprehensive, unforgiving blueprint for structural disruption. The legacy world is being dismantled exactly along these lines.
We would love to hear your thoughts on this analysis. Please leave a comment below with your specific questions, or let's stimulate some debate on which of these startup frameworks you see currently playing out, or spectacularly failing in the global markets you operate in today.
The patterns of disruption are everywhere, in every sector, once you understand the underlying mechanics to look for.
And I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over as you analyze the markets this week. If the ultimate structural goal of a wildly successful startup is to build an inescapable, vertically integrated monopoly that extracts massive value from the global economy. At what precise point does the brilliant, disruptive underdog become the exact same massive, slow-moving, rent-extracting incumbent that the next generation of hungry founders is destined to destroy? Are we actually creating a better global economy, or are we just accelerating a relentless cycle of creating the very monsters we originally set out to slay? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, keep analyzing the structures around you, and we'll see you next time.